In today's video, we're going to be talking about the one watercolor painting technique that I consider to be the most important one for you to master, and some of the mistakes that people make when trying to get this right. Welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel I make watercolor painting videos as well as drawing and mixed media tutorials, even some business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you'll get notified every time I have a new video for you. Make at least one free video a week here on YouTube with extra content for Patreon subscribers. So let's not keep you waiting. What do I consider to be the most important technique to learn with watercolor painting? It is a flat wash. Now, a lot of people might say to me, well, there isn't really, there aren't many subjects where you need to do a completely perfect flat wash. So, what's the problem with it? The thing is, a flat wash, it enables you to control the paint. So if you can simply apply your watercolor paint to a flat, large area or a smaller area without any imperfections, drying lines, cauliflowers, backruns, blooms, whatever you like to call them in your part of the world, if you can do this, then it means you have control over the paint. And that is going to be a basis for you to work up to all of the other techniques. In fact, in my online course, my Watercolor Basics course, it is one of the first things that I teach. So we're going to look at it today. Now, I'm going to first explain to you why people have so much trouble getting a flat wash, why it completely differs from all other paint mediums that there are, why you need to take a completely different approach to any other paint medium that is specific to watercolor paints. And then we're going to look at 10 mistakes that I see people make again and again. You'll be able to avoid these mistakes and get a much better result with your flat washes. And once you can do a flat wash, you can pretty much work up from there and learn to do anything with watercolor painting. The very last mistake that I'm going to show you today is the one that I consider is the biggest mistake that people make. So whether you've just started painting or you've been painting for a little while, if you ever get drying lines and backruns that you don't want, then today we're going to fix that. So let's have a look first of all at why this can be so difficult. And whilst I'm demonstrating, I'm going to tell you a little story. So years ago, I used to belong to a business networking group that was local to me. This may seem a very strange thing for an artist to do, but actually at the time I was running local art fairs and curating exhibitions. It made perfect sense to connect with local people. It wasn't an arts group. There were all sorts of different business people and self-employed people within the group. We used to take it in turns to give demonstrations. Some of these would be interactive. People would do little quizzes, slideshows, things like that. And then it came to my turn. Now, the reason we gave these little talks and demonstrations was for the people in our group to be able to recommend us to other people with confidence, because in some business networking groups, people will just recommend each other and they don't even know if the person they're recommending is any good. So the idea is that we would demonstrate our skill level so the other people in the group would understand that we actually could deliver on our services. So it was my turn and I thought, what can I do to show the people in this group who know nothing about art or artists, to be honest, that I know what I'm talking about. And I was, as well as running art fairs, I was teaching an awful lot of classes. I was always looking for new students. And so I came up with an idea. And the idea was that I would get them to paint something with no instruction whatsoever. And then I would teach them a little bit about it. And they would have another go at the same thing and they would do better. So what did I do? I threw them completely under the bus. I gave them some pieces of paper with squares on like this. And I gave them a simple task. I gave them some paint palettes, some little ones like this, and I squeezed out some fresh paint. I've got some paint here. This is some red oxide on here, and they had a variety of colours, but I just asked them to do one thing for me. I asked them to paint the paint into the square on their paper and to apply it smoothly and evenly. That's all I wanted from them. And I knew that knowing nothing about watercolour painting, they would get this very wrong. So what did they do? They started to paint and they got some water and they thought, well, this isn't too difficult, is it? All I've got to do is apply this paint neatly to the square. So they started painting. Now, if you've ever done any painting, of walls or any medium where things kind of stay wet for a bit longer. So, even things like icing a cake, the paint stays wet, doesn't it? So what you can do is you can take quite a bit of time, spreading things out. And please be conscious of the fact that, as always on this channel, I'm trying to demonstrate how to do things wrong. It's really hard for me to do it wrong because I know how to do it right. But basically, this is what happened. They were having a great laugh and they all started chatting, and they would sort of start painting for a bit and then stop, and then they would get sort of paint that had, a lot of water in, and then they're thinking, oh, Should the colour be a bit lighter, let's put some more water in. Maybe the colour should be a little bit lighter. And so they would start doing that. And then they would, you know, try to fill in this little square. Oh, the paint's got a bit watery. Let's get some thicker paint there. Let's put some more paint on this bit here. So Michelle said that I need to get this paint on sort of evenly. Well, it's all gone light over here. Let's go back on that bit there and try and spread that out. And you know, they would finish painting their square and they'd chat to the person next to them, and then they'd sort of look at it and say, well, hang on, you know, as it's drying, it's not looking so even anymore. Let me just get the brush and let's see if I can, you know, if I can sort this out, and if I can stop this from drying with all these little lines in. Maybe I need to put some clean water on it to smooth it out. So let's rinse my paintbrush. You know, let's put some clean water on it and just see if we can get it looking a bit smoother here. And well, you can imagine what happened. Basically, the more they fiddled with it, the worse it got. And even when they thought they hadn't done that badly, by the time they'd sort of turned and had a chat to their neighbour and got themselves a cup of coffee and gone back to their work, they were astonished to see that it was actually very uneven. And it was getting worse by the minute as it dried. So then we had a little bit of a tutorial, and I explained to them that they need to apply the paint much more evenly and much more quickly, and they need to start methodically on one side and work across. And so I showed them how to be a little bit more methodical with their work and to apply the paint evenly and quickly, and then to leave it alone. Now, some people are naturally a little bit quicker at picking up practical skills like this than others. So some of them on the second time round got it looking really good. And others, well, it wasn't fantastic, but it was a lot better than their first attempt. And that small demonstration enabled me to show them in a really practical way that I could teach them how to apply paint in a much more effective manner, really by just a few minutes tuition. But of course, there are actually quite a few mistakes you can make when applying a flat wash, and that's what we're going to look at today. So mistake number one when making a flat wash is not to mix enough paint. This is so easily done. The watercolour paper is always a bit more absorbent than we think it might be. It's so easy, isn't it, to be painting a large area and then all of a sudden you find you've run out of the colour you've mixed. Not only is it disastrous to stop a flat wash halfway across, and we'll find out why that is as we go through, but also you've very little chance of getting that colour mixed exactly the same again. Even if it's a single pigment, you're just using water. Unless you get the levels of water exactly the same, it's going to dry a different colour. So the last thing you want to do is run out of paint. So let me show you how much you need to mix. So let's talk about mixing enough paint. So basically the rule is you want to mix double the amount of paint that you think that you need to get across the area. And if it's a particularly large area like a sky, double it again, mix 4 times the amount of paint that you think you are going to need to cover that area, because you'll almost always get it wrong and underestimate how much of the paint the paper is going to soak up. Now let me be honest, a mixing palette like this is not sufficient for mixing a flat wash. You need something deeper, something you can get more paint and more liquid into. Now, I like things like this. This, of course, once housed something like some hummus or a little takeaway condiment that I got with an Indian takeaway, perhaps. These are fantastic for mixing washes in. And don't be afraid to actually start with water. So I sometimes actually tip the water in. I'm not going to do it now because knowing me, it'll go everywhere. But you can actually start with water. If you've got a really large flat wash, don't be afraid to start by tipping some water in and starting big, particularly if you're using a strong colour, and then mix the paint in and keep swatching it on a scrap of paper until you've got the right colour. Remember to allow it to dry as well because it's going to dry lighter. Now, if you're not a fan of plastic as a mixing surface, then things like this are great. You can buy dishes like this in kitchenware shops. You get large ones like this for dips or slightly smaller ones for butter pats. I actually found 4 of these in a charity shop when I was on holiday for about £2. So always worth looking in those places too. A lot of people prefer the way paint mixes on ceramic because it doesn't bead up. It doesn't actually make much difference as far as the application goes. But if you like something that looks a bit fancier, then a little ceramic dish like this is great. Make sure you pick one that's white. This will enable you to see the colours properly. So mistake number 2 is not preparing your paper properly. Paper preparation is going to make a real difference to how the paint applies. What do I mean by this? Let me show you. So let's talk about preparing your paper. Now, the best surface to work on is always stretched paper. I'm working here on a board of stretched paper. Now, you won't always see me do this on YouTube because it's expensive and sometimes I'm just doing little quick techniques. I've actually got a mark on this board here, so I thought I'd use it today because you do get a much better result. Now, the reason you get a better result is because you don't get dips in the paper as much. So let's apply some paint to this piece of paper here. And this is a very thin piece of paper, just to exaggerate the situation, and we'll put some water on there. And what will start to happen is the paper will start to stretch and it'll start to move, and you end up with it bowing upwards like this. And then what will happen is the water will start to pool. So on a small piece of paper like this, it will bow up in the middle as the paper's stretching, because paper expands as it gets wet, and you'll end up with some pooling either around the edge or, like it is here, over to one side. Now, on a large piece of paper, if you're doing a landscape, what you'll find is you actually get ripples forming. You must have seen those ripples forming. And what happens is the water will sit in the dips of the ripples. Now, wet paint is attracted to damp paint. So what will happen is the area where there's less paint will start to dry. And then these areas here where there's more paint will start to bleed across and make these very strong drying lines appear on your paper. So the upshot is that the flatter your paper, the easier it is to keep your water levels even. Now, you might be looking at my paper where it's stretched here and say, well, I can see that this paper has bowed up, and you're correct. The paper has lifted up a bit and it is going through a process of stretching and buckling. They call it buckling, sometimes they call it cockling. However, stretching your paper like this will much reduce that from happening. And stretching your paper also enables you to use a much thinner paper than you would otherwise be able to use, so it saves you money too. Now, there are alternatives. You can use something called a watercolor block, which is basically a pad of watercolor paper that's been glued around 3.5 sides, and it will also help to keep your paper flat. To my mind, it's not quite as good as stretched paper, and it's certainly more expensive, but that can work too if you really can't face stretching your paper. And let me say now, it's really fast and easy. People make far too much of a fuss about it. I've got a simple video on this channel. I'll try and link it in the description below if you want to start stretching your paper. Gives you great results and saves you money. Now, if you are really lazy, you don't want to do any of those things, at least tape your paper down around the edges and use the thickest paper you can, because the thicker the paper, the less it buckles. As I said, you can use the thinner paper and stretch it. But if you're not going to stretch, then at least tape your paper down and use thick paper, because the more you can get your paper so that it's buckling less and cockling less as you paint on it, the less your paint is going to sit in the dips and the more evenly it's going to dry, and that's going to enable you to get a much better flat wash. The next mistake is not using the right brush and not using the right size of brush. So let's talk now about brushes. So which brush should you use for your flat wash? Well, the simple answer is the biggest brush possible, and a flat brush where it's practical. So I was using a round brush here, and they call this type of brush with the point a round brush because the part here, the metal part, is round, the ferrule is round. It's a brush that holds quite a lot of paint in the body of the bristles. It's your standard watercolor painting brush. And for a smaller area, or an area where you need to go round quite a delicate edge, then this is a great brush to use. You should use the biggest possible brush that you can wield in the area that you are working. If it's a very tiny area, of course you can go smaller than this, but your advantage is in having enough of the body at the belly of the brush here to hold enough paint that it just keeps flowing smoothly and you don't get lots of drying lines. One of the reasons people get lots of tiny drying lines is because they use a brush that's far too small. It doesn't enable them to get across the area fast enough. Now, having said that, if you have room and if you're working on much of a larger area, particularly something like a sky, if you can go up to a flat brush like this one, this is going to spread the paint much faster. If you've got a combination, in other words, you've got a large area with perhaps a complex edge, don't be afraid to use two brushes and swap between them. So you apply most of the paint with this, you swap in quickly to use your pointed brush to go round the edges. So the answer to the question of what brush you use for a flat wash is the largest brush possible. For smaller, more delicate, fiddly areas, you use a round brush like this. If you've got the room, then use a flat brush. Now, the next mistake that people often make with flat washes is just painting too slowly. So we need an even application of paint. We need there to be even drying times right across the area that you're painting in. And so we need to work quickly. So let's look at that next. So did you notice that one of the things I did on my first two samples when I did the second sample was I worked really quickly? So Mixing up enough paint, of course, ensures that you're just ready to go. You don't have to stop. And then so important just to work quickly. So we're just applying the paint quickly and evenly. Now, applying it quickly like this means that there won't be any difference between the amount of dampness. I'll grab that splodge in a moment. Here we go. There won't be any difference in the water levels from one side of this area to the other. That's going to enable it to dry quickly and evenly, and it's why working fast is more important than fussing about getting it 100% perfect. So the next mistake is ending up leaving puddles or areas of wetter paint on your flat wash. And what will happen in this case is that the rest of the flat wash will start to dry, and that little puddle of paint, be it ever so tiny, will start to creep across and cause a drying line in your flat wash. Now, it's not just a matter of avoiding great big puddles in the middle of your paper. They can also occur around the edge of the board or near the tape. I'm going to show you now a couple of strategies for getting rid of these and stopping them from causing you problems. So let's talk about puddles and how we stop them forming. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually apply this paint right up to the edge of my tape as if I were, applying a sky or something like that. I've just got a sort of a mixed blue-grey here. I'm just going to apply like this. Now, if you're filling in a specific area like we're doing with our circles and squares, you can often find as you get to the end, you end up with a little puddle. Now, what you don't want to do is this, because you see the mark that it leaves. So you don't want to do that. But if you do need to lift out a puddle, and let me put one artificially on the paper here. If you do want to lift out a puddle, what you do is you dry your brush so that it's just damp, and then you're just going to make little dots like this. And as long as you're quick, that's going to just lift up the paint. You can do it with any shape brush, so you can do it with this shape brush as well, because as you apply wet paint, if you dry your brush, you can use that brush to soak up the water. Now, don't do it like this because you will leave a mark. But if you've got a puddle and you just want to get rid of that puddly area, dry your brush and then just tiny little dots like this, and you're just going to soak up the excess paint. You need to work quickly in this case. Another thing that can happen, do you see around the edge of the paper here, I'm getting some tiny little bits of puddling forming. Sometimes it actually goes underneath the edge of the tape. So if you've got a large area like this and you've gone up to the edge of the tape, what you want to do is get your paper towel and just run along the edge like this. Now you see that we've lifted out about 1 millimetre of paint. That really doesn't matter because in the case of a painting that would be underneath your mount anyway. It's likely just to fill itself back in, but you must make sure that there's no liquid sitting around the edge or underneath the edge of your tape, because what will happen is this big area here will dry, and then later on the puddle will start to creep back in. You don't even know it's there. It's biding its time. It's going to sneak in later on and ruin your flat wash. At this point in the video, as always, can I ask you please to do me a favour and click that like button, click that thumbs up for me. YouTube rewards channels with audience interaction. So if you like the video, or better yet, share it with someone else, or leave me a comment or subscribe, which is completely free, then YouTube will push this video out to more people. I'm trying to get the channel at the moment at 100,000 subscribers, and I'm so grateful to all of you who watch me on YouTube. So the next mistake is not considering granulation. Now, certain colours granulate. If you're very new to watercolour painting, you may have noticed that some of your colours dry with little speckles in. I actually had someone say to me that a teacher had told them that these were inferior paints if they had speckles in. This is absolutely not true. It's just a matter that certain pigments have larger granules and they will dry with a speckled effect. They can be very beautiful, but of course it's not going to be the easiest thing to do a flat wash with. Now, can you do a flat wash with granulating paints? Absolutely you can, and you should be able to still get an even application of paint without drying lines or anything like that. But of course, it's never going to look as transparent and as clean as a staining colour. That's a colour that's more like ink and doesn't have any noticeable granules in. Let me show you the difference. So this lovely bright green here, I mixed it from azo yellow and phthalo blue. Those are both transparent, clear staining colours. So a staining colour looks somewhat like ink. It's strong, it's clear, and as the name suggests, it stains the paper. So there's the mix there. You can see how bright and clear it is even in the dish. Now look at this one here. I mixed this one from yellow ochre, which is essentially an earth colour. It not only granulates, but it has some opacity. and I mixed it with cerulean blue, which is also a heavily granulating colour. Now, there is nothing wrong with granulating colours, but they will give you a bit more texture. So let's just look at the difference where I apply. And what you'll notice straight away is that you can see more of the grain of the paper. And that's because the pigments are settling into the little dips. Now, it may be that you're painting something like a kiwi fruit that has got a lot of granular texture to it, and you might need a colour just like this one. So I want to emphasize there's nothing wrong with granulating colours, but it is something to consider when you are wanting to apply a flat wash of colour. Do you want this smoothness like this, or do you want the texture here? Now, this is still a good flat wash. There aren't any drying lines in it. It's gone on just fine. It's simply that the properties of the paint pigments mean that we're not going to get as smooth and clear an application as this one here. Now, applying a flat wash relies on even application of paint. And if you are using granulating colours, even if it's one granulating colour in a mixture of other colours, you're going to need to stir your paint as you apply. Let me show you why this is. So I've got a couple of colour mixes here that I've mixed cerulean into. So we have the green that I just used, but also I have this one here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tip this little dish, and you'll be able to see that all the cerulean granules have fallen to the bottom. So if I tip like this, can you see all of that blue-green paint? There was some granulating yellow in there as well. You can see that's all gone to the bottom. So if I mix a colour and I don't stir it as I apply it, you won't need to do that as much with staining colour, by the way. This is just if you're using a colour with some granulating pigments, you're going to need to stir literally before you start, and then every time you dip your brush in. Even the green that I mixed up just now, it's only been sat for about 5 minutes, if that, but look how the colour has changed from the top to the bottom. So every time I want to get my flat wash, if I'm using granulating pigments, I'm going to need to constantly stir that colour so that the colour remains stable, because otherwise what you're going to find is that each time you dip in, you're getting a different distribution of those pigments, and you're not going to get an even application of colour. So even if you apply your flat wash perfectly, it's not going to look any good, because you're going to get lots of different colours and pigments within the same area. Now, the next mistake is not dividing the area which you work in into smaller areas. This is when you've got a flat wash that goes around, multiple complex shapes. Even for the most experienced artist, it can be really difficult to get this right. So a little bit of a trick is to actually divide that area up physically into smaller areas. This is particularly handy with things like botanicals, but it goes for other subjects too. I'm going to show you one of my own paintings now and explain how to do this. So you're looking at a painting I did of some poppies, and I've got a flat wash in the background behind the poppies here. Now you see it's not perfect. In fact, the top was quite hard to do because I did actually go round the top in one go, and I did start on one side and work methodically along to the other side without going back. But another thing that I did is I divided up areas. So each of these, although it looks like the blue just goes naturally behind everything, if you know anything about watercolour painting, you'll know that I couldn't take the blue behind the bright red, otherwise we'd get a very muddy purple. So each of these areas was painted individually. And you see the more lines I've got, the more bits of leaf and stem that I've got dividing these areas up, the smaller they become. So if you're quite new to painting and you're not great at flat washes, then make the areas smaller. Now, if they go very, very tiny, you may find they're actually quite hard to put in, but you can just take them down so that they are a manageable size. If you've got an area like this, for instance, and you think to yourself, I'm not sure I can paint that large an area of flat wash quickly enough to keep the water levels even, then all you do is you just draw another stem in and you divide this area into two. And so it becomes smaller like these ones here. If you need a large area of flat wash, take a little bit of artistic license and divide your area up as much as you need to so that you can go in easily. And remember that the bigger the area, the bigger the brush you'll use. For a smaller area, you'll need to swap to a smaller brush. So the next mistake is not accepting tiny imperfections. Now, whenever we paint, we're always taking a risk that it could be always something a bit strange going on. Might be a brush hair comes out of your brush, or a little bit of fluff, some imperfection on the paper, something in the paint. You just get something that doesn't look quite right. Another thing that can happen, of course, if you're not careful with handling your paper, is there could be a spot of grease on the paper. I've seen people have got hairspray on their paper by accident or sun oil or something like that, and this is going to actually make a mark when you apply the paint. Now, no amount of prodding at that is going to make it go away, so I want you to accept your imperfections. The best way to approach an imperfection is to let that layer dry completely and then put another layer on top. Any minor imperfections should actually be smoothed out with the second application, because you are re-wetting, and although paint has a type of glue in it and it's sort of stuck to your paper, when you apply a second coat, you're going to lift that pigment just slightly enough to blur your first layer. So let me show you how you put a second layer on your flat wash. And if you do get some kind of imperfection, I want you to completely leave it alone. If you get a brush hair, let it dry, pick it off with a pin or something like that, and then put another layer of paint on top. Let me show you how to do that. So let's go back to this flat wash here, and we're going to put another layer in. Now, although it's a very good flat wash, there are one or two imperfections in it. There are one or two areas where it's not as smooth as it could be. And perhaps, as I said, I had something go wrong with this one. Perhaps there was a little hair or something that had to be picked off later on, and we've got a little bit of an imperfection there. And to be clear, if you didn't want to actually change the colour or darken the colour at all, yes, you could, of course, do this with water as well. But what I'm going to do here is place another layer on top. And whenever you do a flat wash or any area of colour, if you feel that you're not happy with the colour, it's too light perhaps, it's not smooth enough, it's much better to allow it to dry so that it's more fixed to the paper, and that the paper is a more stable surface, because when paper's wet, it's more fragile. And then all you need to do is apply another layer. This technique is actually called glazing, when you put one transparent colour over another, but it has the added benefit that it's going to smooth out the layer underneath. You could even take an area like this, maybe not get it 100% how you want it, but you could certainly improve it a lot by taking a second layer of paint or clean water over the top. So this next mistake is the one I actually consider to be the worst mistake that people make. It's the one that's really tempting to do, and that's to go back in previously painted areas whilst they're still damp. Let me show you why this is so disastrous. So I've got an area of damp paint here. Now, what happens if I'm really not happy with it? I just think I'll just go back with my paintbrush. I'll just touch up, that bit there, and perhaps we'll just smooth out that area. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to make an uneven area. You're going to make a wetter area, and it's going to spread out. I'm going to do this in a different color, just so that it's easier for you to see on camera. So we've got this damp area here, and we're going back in. Now, even if I wasn't using a different color, we'd still see this as it dries. This is basically how you make cauliflowers, how you make those bloom shapes. Now, I was doing a previous video and I talked about these as being a mistake, and somebody had a big go at me in the comments and sounded off and said, oh, well, people do these on purpose, blah, blah. Of course they do them on purpose. Of course they do. The point is not that these are right or wrong. The point is that if you're trying to paint a nice flat sky and you get one of these, it is going to be a mistake. So yes, these are very beautiful. Yes, you can do them on purpose. Of course you can. But in this video, we're talking about getting a flat wash. And the biggest mistake that people make is to have a damp area of paint and they think to themselves, I'll just go back to that bit. I'll just go back to that bit there. So we mustn't go back like this, but what do we do if we've got an area that is so large, not just a small area like this, it's so large, we really can't paint it as quickly as we want to keep the water levels even. In that case, all you need to do is to keep the leading edge moving and don't go back. So don't go back in like this. So let me show you, and I'll just paint randomly on the paper here. So say that we've got, this area here and we're painting around things. I won't in this case actually touch these areas, at least I'll try not to because they may still be damp. So we're going around like this. Now we can't paint quickly enough because we've got such a large area to cover. We can't paint quickly enough to keep the amount of wetness here the same as what's going on back there. This is going to start to dry whilst this is still wet. However, as long as we don't go back, as long as we don't put wet paint where there's damp paint, we can just keep on painting indefinitely. So all you need to worry about is keeping this leading edge here moving. So we're just going to keep this moving. Now this is drier certainly, but because it increases gradually, so it goes dry, 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 damp, 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 down to wet, because it increases gradually, you're not going to get that sharp delineation between a damp area and a very wet area. And so you can just keep painting. All you have to do is keep this leading edge moving, and you see that I've got enough paint mixed up. I can keep going round and round. Very important for botanicals, things like that. And even though this area here has started to dry, as long as I don't go back and I just keep the leading edge moving, I can keep this flat wash going on pretty much indefinitely. But what I mustn't do is I mustn't look back here and with my wet brush think to myself, oh, I'll just touch that bit there, because that's when we get this effect happening and it all goes wrong. So do let me know in the comments if this video has given you any aha moments, if it's helped you with your flat wash technique. Trust me, if you can get this right, everything else is going to be much easier for you. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. I've got lots of free stuff down there for you. I've got some free downloadable PDFs. I've even got a free watercolor painting course that you can take for no money whatsoever. Now, if you are learning to paint in watercolors, I have lots of free content here for you on this channel. But I've also got a complete beginner's watercolor course that's going to take you right from the basics of flat washes through things like graduated washes, all of those really basic techniques that you need. I'll leave details of that course down in the video description too. Now, many of you who are learning watercolors also like to paint in watercolor pencils. They're a great medium, but of course mistakes can be made with those too. I've got a great video all about watercolor pencils mistakes. You can watch that video right now.